Hey, I'm a little late starting today, but what are you going to do? First, a small programming note. Uh, I'm going to be on vacation next week, if you care about such things. And I've been thinking I should queue up some, I don't know, pre recorded material to play, but you know what? I'm probably going to do nothing. I might be able to break away, and I can show you some of the fascinating tiny videos that I do. Those are sometimes fun. Let me adjust one of my lights here. There we go. So hi, hello again. So today I was thinking of something to talk about, and I remembered in a conversation I had recently, someone asked about chargebacks, how we do chargebacks. Now chargebacks and showbacks. Like this is one of those phrases when you're talking about IT stuff, you always have to show off your knowledge about stuff and your kind of sophistication by saying chargebacks and showbacks. And there's probably some third phrase that people have come up with. I bet there's some analyst analysis that is essentially comes up with all sorts of names for things. But chargebacks are interesting. I think it's essentially like started out as a kind of a way to figure out recouping, or as the name would imply, charging businesses for using your IT stuff, right? Now, I think it's kind of, as I'll get into, it's kind of a weird, touchy topic because, most of the way people think about IT, most of what makes them more traditional companies instead of thinking like tech companies, or, if you remember from yesterday and my sort of idea of what it means to do digital transformation, is they think about IT as a service, that kind of Nicholas Carr, IT doesn't matter, dial tone or electricity current. They just want to drive the cheapest cost to it because to them, it's kind of like an interchangeable part and whatever you buy doesn't really matter. It's kind of like, I don't know, baggies or containers to put your leftover food in. There's some variation in them, but really, like, you can just buy the store brand if it's the cheapest. You're not really going to get that much variation, and everything on top is, on top of that is just some fun, right? So most people don't think that, to use a Porterian term, that there's any competitive advantage to IT. So therefore, it becomes a cost thing where you want to get the cheapest thing. Now, I don't know about you, but I have used IT at a very small organization. And I've used IT at a very large organization. And large organizations are pretty good at optimizing their costs. And as I like to think about it, you get what you pay for, and it shows. I think there are some benefits that you have. Like if you ever use the Google suite of things and combine it together with sort of best of breed little services here or there, the overall cost, especially when it comes to management, might be more. But in general, it's nicer than standardizing on older things. Now, that said, I've had to use Office 365 here at VMware, and I don't know, it's fine. It's just a different usage paradigm. It's a different way of thinking about it and different features, but ultimately, it's okay. I think the multi-person document editing has a lot to be desired, but also that's because I don't think in the terms of using a desktop GUI. Anyhow, digression. So let's get into the chargeback thing. Now, let me sort of, I've got my usual show notes. I've actually done a lot more detail here than as usual, as I've been kind of thinking out what to talk about this. Let me move these over here. I've got my crazy setup. I'll share the screen with you so you can follow along. I'll go to what I call one head, big screen. And let's zoom this over here so you can take a look at it. Now, just as it's not a disclaimer because I get to set the terms of this. So this is a vendor pitch, not the infamous no vendor pitch I'm often asked to do. But we have here at VMware, a couple of things that will help you with chargebacks, notably, I think, Cloud Health. I've got to be honest with you. I'm not super familiar with all of them, but in the VMware portfolio of things across traditional systems management and cloud native things, we had all sorts of stuff that helps you out with that, including kind of close to the Tanzu portfolio, Cloud Health. And you can probably pull in, you can, as I'll get into, you can pull in and synthesize a lot of this stuff. But we have plenty of things to offer here. There are other options out there for sure that you want to do. So let's take a look at kind of how I would start thinking about chargebacks. Now, I want to start with there's a good Wikipedia thing here, right? Like, it's always good to look at them and think about where things come from, right? And I think it all amounts to, if you're treating IT as a utility, and if you're really interested in doing accounting and financial stuff, there's a couple of things you want to accomplish. And I think there's some nuance to this that is pretty interesting to add to. But one, as IT, oftentimes you are a cost center. You don't actually make money. This is a big problem. No one thinks that your contribution to the business is is worth including. You're just a cost, which is sort of like, I don't know, the CEO of a company is just a cost, right? Like, everything is just a cost if you think about it that way. But really, all of the staff of a company are how the company is generating money. And if they're not, then the executives have a problem on their hands, and they need to figure that out. They've kind of done their work ineffectively. But getting out of naive happy talk land, right? Like, if you're providing IT as a service, you need to figure out a way to recoup those costs, to charge for it, and basically try to achieve zero cost, right? Like, that's the dream of an IT organization in this way of thinking, is that we are actually, we can account for the money that we've spent because the BUs are paying us back for it. So we have to present them with a bill. And then essentially kind of using, at IBM, they call it blue money. And I think at Dell, they call it that too. But it may not be actual money, but we're sort of accounting for as money that's moving around in the spreadsheets of the company and, basically charging for it. Now, I think as the third part gets to, there's also some tactical uses for it. One of those tactical uses, and product managers can sometimes use this if they're being kind of, I wouldn't call it dastardly, but they're being a little Machiavellian. Machiavelli gets a bad rap, but all the guy's trying to go over is like, how do you just do things in the real world? What do things actually look like versus ideal? But that's a very oversimplification. I don't think I've ever actually read The Prince. I should probably go look at that, let alone his other works, which I've read references to elsewhere, and they seem kind of interesting. But I think it's also a way, as always, when you're dealing with two separate groups, of negotiating the terms of things, right? So when you kind of are showing people how much some IT service costs, and what you're doing is not only are you showing it to them, but as this third part gets to, you're allowing them to prioritize what they want and drive decisions, right? So if nothing costs anything and you can always get it, you'll just always get everything, right? Like, if there's no cost to it, you might as well consume all of it. As buffets in America will show you. They just opened a Asian buffet here in the neighborhood recently, and I think it's something outrageous compared to American prices, like 25 euros. So what is that, like $28, $30? And but I don't know, just a buffet is nice. Like that, I've found that if you're trying to maintain healthiness, the benefit of a buffet is that you can sample all of the things. You may not eat a lot of all of the things, but you get a variety of all the things, kind of a sampler sort of platter, which I think is a good benefit to look at. And sure, you can eat more than you should. But when you have a chargeback, what it's also allowing you to do is allow the buyers, the business units, or whoever you're charging back to prioritize things. Now, I think, let's see if I actually saved this. Did I? Yeah, I don't think I saved a link to that. I should look it up. But there was actually some nice slides. Let me go ahead and look it up, because I think there was a pretty interesting kind of take on it here. Kubernetes cost allocation. So let's see if we can find the. This is probably from a competitor to our VMware stuff. So pretend that you didn't see it. Okay? Do not look at that. I don't want you to get any ideas about other people that you should be spending money on. That would be just terrible. Let me see if I can find this. Anyhow, I really should look that up, because there was some good points about. Well, here. Let me see. Maybe I put it over here. You get to see the sausage being made. Isn't that exciting? There must be some alternative things for. Oh, here it is for sausage being made, because it certainly does seem gross, right? What I should bring up is a video of sausage being made. I don't know. I think it's fine. I don't get extremely squeamish about stuff like that, but my understanding is that many people do. But thanks for tolerating me looking this up. I think there's a good slide in here that goes over some other things that are interesting, right? So the other reason you might be interested in chargebacks, other than just sort of this accounting of making sure you get paid for things and kind of showing the value of IT, they kind of go over some things here. Like there's some tactical reasons, right? Like if you're actually tracking costs, right, you can find waste in the system, right? So you almost have an incentive. You don't have to have this incentive, but it allows you to find when people just are over allocated, right? When they have things sitting there idle that you could eliminate that are causing you costs so that you can eliminate them, right? Like one of the benefits of containers, and way before that in the 2000s of VMs from VMware and perhaps other people who VMware competed with. I don't really know about any of them. As far as I'm concerned, only VMware existed. But you get this idea of packing more compute, more containers, more VMs onto a machine, and therefore getting more value out of containers. Now, one, that's value that you're getting, but if you remember your Jevons paradox, which us IT people, starting with Luke Knies, really melded in to talk about how you drive more value with optimization, just because you're removing costs, because you're not doing things overage. What it does mean, though, is that you're freeing up resources to do more with, right? So you can invest more time and more money into doing stuff. So it's good to find that waste that you have in the system if you're also kind of monitoring for chargebacks. And what that means is as they go over, right? Like you get these new options, you get new functionality because you've removed waste, and it allows you to do something with that time and that money instead of spending it on wasteful things, right? Which I think is a fair point when it comes to, I wouldn't necessarily call that chargebacks, but I would call that like financial tracking of your usage, right? So it's good to do that. I remember there used to be, let's see if they're still around. I remember one of the more interesting briefings I got way back when at Redmonk was with, was it Zebra, like IT cost tracking? This company got bought by someone a long time ago. But they had a fun way of like, maybe is it still called Densify? Oh, and there's also Aptio. Let's see what I wrote about Aptio way back then. Another company that doesn't exist because they compete with things that we have to offer, but we'll just pretend like they do. Oh yeah, and then you can see that doing cost stuff, just like with APM and automation, it goes in a cycle. Like I remember one of my former bosses started this company, Evapt, which I forget, some company bought them as well. But, we're always doing cost accounting and tracking finance and chargeback and things like that. There we go, Serba. They had some of the best visualizations of these types of things. Boy, it sure was fun blogging. Oh yeah, it is Densify, right? So, there's all sorts of options out there. I'm gonna put them on my list of things to go check out for my my cost accounting sort of research. But so that's kind of what you're looking at when you're doing chargebacks. Okay, so when people ask, and this comes up every now and then, when we're going over a new type of platform, a Kubernetes, this would happen a lot with Pivotal Cloud Foundry, or the Tanzu application service, as we like to call it now, TAS, or TAS, if you will. I think what would come up frequently is, hold on, I was doing some editing, and I wanted to insert little funny things, although I shouldn't use copyrighted stuff, so I'm not going to do that. But let me get a pin here, and around too much discussion around. I was thinking I should put a picture of the Tasmanian devil in there, but I'm sure someone would be upset about that if with copyright things. But now, what they're often asking, I think, are, they know what chargebacks are, and they're asking, one, what model do you use for chargebacks? And two, what's the technicalness? what's the technology stuff behind it? How do you technically do it? And three, sometimes, I mean, often they're also asking, what do other people do? So I want to cover those things. And I think, something that as I kind of start wading through a lot of trying to figure out, that mindset book and body of work that I'm thinking about doing, but also kind of as a consequence, wading through some dimming things and kind of figuring that out. Like, I think with most anything like this, it's good to figure out what your goal is. What are you trying to accomplish? And what are the goals you're operating above that, right? So with Chargeback, on the face of it, sort of like easy goal that you're trying to achieve is what I was saying is we want to know how much IT is costing, and we want to make people using it internally pay for it. So it's not just some free buffet that they come to, because we in the IT department are under pressure to, I don't know, drive down costs or just kind of like figure out what it is. Now, in public cloud, and we vendors who are not exclusively public cloud vendors, we love this chain of thinking. We just are all over it. But in public cloud, it's not so much chargebacks that people are immediately interested in with finance stuff as what I would call kind of capacity management and financial planning, where they don't want to be presented with a big bill that was unexpected because their consumption has gone up, right? Like, I mean, it's equivalent. If you remember the Orange case from yesterday, right? Like, you don't want to, as a small business at the end of the month, see that you have like 5,000 euros in data overages because your delivery drivers or delivery scooterers, your delivery people were like, watching a bunch of stuff on your mobile phones between deliveries. So you don't want those unexpected costs. You want to plan for them. And, that's perfectly valid. But I think when it comes to chargeback, the first thing that you need to know, right, is once you start charging someone for something, you're giving them a disincentive to use it, right? Like whenever I have to pay for something, the more expensive it is, the less likely I am to use it. And, if it's cheaper, it's a lot easier to use, right? Oftentimes, companies will just charge like $1 or €1 or a nominal fee just to kind of weed out the freeloaders, right? Who will just kind of come take stuff for free. So I would start with that, right? Like the first thing that's going to be a cause, I don't know if I don't know my categorizations of causes, but it's a cause that you don't care about, right? Like it's a second order effect that's not really in your area, is it's going to change their desire to want to use something. Now, this comes up very frequently, especially in when it comes to Pivotal Cloud Foundry, Tanzu Application Service, Kubernetes, when you're putting a new platform in. Because if you remember back to the TD Ameritrade ROI tracking case, and there's a link to it there if you're interested, what you end up seeing is that your goal in putting one of these new platforms in place, your goal in digital transformation is improving the business, is modernizing your platform, is getting people to write applications that run on a new platform, that are done, your software is done in a new way that allows you to start programming your business. So your goal is usage, right? Is adoption of the platform, is getting workloads onto the new platform, getting businesses, types of products you have using this software in a new way. So you really need to make sure that when you're doing chargeback, is it going to help that goal, right? Is it going to help the overall system achieve the goals that you have, not just sort of achieve financial responsibility for IT, right? And already what we have here, here's my hands, I'm ready to go, is we have a conflict between the overall system, right? The overall company, the multiple parts of the system across the organization and business units, and then one little component, one unit in that overall value stream, that overall system. And this is a great example of local optimization that damages the whole system, right? So if this one part of the system, IT, is actually running at a net zero financial whatever, I don't know the terminology, that might mean that the rest of the system suffers, right? So while IT might be ever cheaper and lowering costs, if that means that the overall business is damaged because their software is lame, then did you really save money? So you, as kind of most of the executives in your organization outside of IT, aren't going to know to think about this. It's going to be your job as an IT person to kind of think on the behalf of the rest of the organization, but you need to spend a lot of time considering if you're going to do more damage than good with chargebacks. And, this is where you can get all fancy with showbacks versus chargebacks and things like that, right? Which is great. Just have a ball with that. And there's a fun note, I forget in one presentation. So a showback is basically a chargeback that you don't have to pay. You're presented with a bill that you don't have to pay, which to some extent, like, I don't want to see those bills. I would just not look at them because I got other stuff going on. But there is some interesting, in some of the presentations you can see about this topic, there's some fun dynamics that you see there where you can kind of drive some competitive dynamics amongst BU people, where even though it's a theoretic amount that the BUs are doing or are paying, they could still try to optimize on consuming the least amount of it. But this might also, even if you're doing that, this drives you towards that tricky problem of, are people going to underinvest in their usage and therefore pay less and get less payoff, right? It's going to result in some problems potentially. So as the IT person who is thinking about doing chargebacks in the platform, the first thing you want to think about is, if I charge for this, is it going to hinder people using the platform and slow down this transformation that we want to do? Is it going to, so this is where the TD Ameritrade thing comes into practice, is if I look at the amount of applications that I'm moving to the new platform, that I'm moving to this new way of doing things, am I moving them at a rate that will allow me to get the value that I wanted, to show the ROI on this investment, to deliver on the goals that we had? And if you find that you stand up a new platform, and again, this happens almost every single time, right? And I think platform adoption, hopefully, I was talking to Rick Clark yesterday, and we're trying to line up someone to come talk to us about this in their organization. But this is a huge problem that IT departments have when they introduce a new platform. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be one of our competitors, which obviously doesn't exist. There's only one platform out there, Tanzu Application Service, and the Tanzu, Kubernetes types of things. None other exists that I know of. But whichever platform that you use, if you just stand it up and you expect people to come use it, they probably won't, right? Not only do you have to spend a lot of time marketing for and advocating for bringing them to it, and then do a lot of internal consultative work to, there should be a better phrase than handhold, and I don't mean it in a derogatory way, but you've got to handhold them to bringing it. Once you also start charging them, you'll find that they won't use it because they have to pay for it. And they too are under the same cost pressures, and they will very quickly, and they being product teams, developers, they will fall into that short-term thinking trap where if we use an open source thing, the time that we spend to stand it up is free. It's already accounted for in the spreadsheet, so it's not additional incremental costs that we have. And they also will not put into account, they won't load in the cost of failure, right? So many of these DIY platform things, I hear over and over again of, 6-12-month projects that cost $1 million in staff time and deliver very anemic, if no sort of working benefit at the end. And then also you have a platform that you got to drive adoption to. You're back in the same problem. But also it doesn't account for the time that it will take to maintain that, and the risk that comes with any system that you build in-house. Even your own valuable software is that you're incurring potential tech debt. You're incurring a sort of older legacy stuff that you're going to be stuck with. And we saw this a lot in the OpenStack world. We certainly see this a lot in every type of software and stack nowadays. As vendors love that, we can go modernize those things for you. But anyhow, always think about new things that you're putting on the tech debt balance sheet. So you're going to drive that kind of behavior when you're doing chargebacks as well. And indeed, if you look at one of the older examples of this, is I didn't go look this up. It would be nice to, here's where I can find that video and splice it in the YouTube thing. Which, if you're not watching this live, if you go, you can put it in the show notes. If you go to tanzu.tv, you can probably look up the playlist in YouTube. And I do a tiny bit of editing when I upload these to YouTube, but it's fun to insert other things. Like if you saw yesterday's, you'll have seen that I put an excerpt from the the sort of orange use case I was referencing, where it's direct from the orange mouth, as it were. Anyhow, what the Home Depot saw was that they set up the platform and they had a way of doing chargebacks, of charging people to use it, and they were shocked that people weren't using it.
We also had some weird stuff. It costs teams money to go into production. So for us, we have this review board process, right? We have this performance testing. We have ServiceNow and Opsware, and there's actual line items. When you go to production, a team gets charged money. We can't figure out what account it goes to or why it's there. It's really frustrating, right? So what we figured out is that by it costing money, whether it be labor, services, software, or whatever, when you ask a lot of questions, the teams don't go to production because it costs money. And so they're starting to batch this, right? Like, okay, let's save some money by just doing, let's build a bunch of stuff and then wait until we push out production and save some cost. So one of the things that we've learned is that we have to get the cost of deployment free. And by doing that, we're going to encourage the teams to push more frequently.
So I forget if it was for the first year, but they essentially removed the price and they made it free for people to use it, which drove up adoption, right? And I think this gets to another point to think about before you actually get to the nitty-gritty of chargebacks, is that, what was the point? I've forgotten. Let me look at my notes here. You remove the cost. Yes, that's right. Let me go to, as always, Rohit has a great way of putting this. I'm going to move over to this, but he, it's fun. It's too bad that we lost him to working at Google, but he's probably going to help Google become more enterprisey. Oh, was that a sort of a backhanded thing there? I'm sure they're great. They there's a lot of people over there that are good. I'm just telling a joke to be a joke. I don't mean to be mean. But he had this piece back from 2017, which you can find in the show notes. And by the way, if you want to see the show notes, you can go to hackmd.io/Tanzu Talk Daily, and then 2020 1006, or just go to Tanzu TV and tanzu.tv and find this episode and click on it. I don't know. It's around somewhere. Anyways, the point being that as with all doing things in a new way stuff, especially something as crazy as doing things in a cloud native way and these things, I think what you want to do is put a learning loop in place, right? So until you've actually done several of these projects, and I would say probably until 12 months after doing it as an organization, I mean, it's going to take that long to kind of learn it, you don't really know how to think about the value that you're delivering. You don't really know what people will want to pay for. You don't know from lean methodology what your product market fit is, right? And so actually, in thinking about this platform you're providing as a product, right? As a service, your platform as a product, think about what the public cloud vendors do or what us vendors do, right? Like we kind of estimate a price and we come up with things, but a lot of what we're doing is we're also kind of floating out and experimenting ideas of packaging and pricing. Right. If you look at ourselves with in the Pivotal world, the Heptio world, the VM, now in the VMware Tanzu world. Now that I've said VMware Tanzu, I can just say Tanzu on its own. But remember when I say Tanzu, I mean VMware Tanzu because VMware does that. Anyhow, what you'll find is that we go through all sorts of ideas of packaging and pricing things. Right. We're always experimenting with the best way to pay for things, the best way to discover what the value is. Now we have ideas of what value is. And the secret is, when it comes to on-premises stuff, everyone always ends up paying by socket. That's just what happens over time. You always end up paying by socket. So eventually we'll get to paying by socket. But until then, and especially if you're doing it on a metered subscription way, there's going to be all sorts of ways that you're thinking about what you charge. And I would imagine inside an organization, you don't want to pay by socket, right? Because when you're paying by socket, you're doing this race against kind of like whatever Moore's law is nowadays, right? Versus the software pricing. There's some weird, gameplay. Pricing between vendors and organizations is always just messing around with who's going to figure out the best horse trade and the way that they want to handle it. But whatever, that's a story for another time. But internally, when you're trying to figure out what you want to do, I would encourage you to not charge for things for a while, like the Home Depot did. And I think if you look at this presentation I'll link to here over at MasterCard, they also kind of are figuring that out. But you should really start to study what the value is that you're delivering, and therefore what should be charged for it, what people are willing to charge for it. And indeed, I think that gets to some of the other concerns about being too soon with doing chargebacks, and without knowing what your goals are, right? So, for example, if one of your goals is that we want to remove tech debt, we want to introduce more agility into what we're doing, we want to make developers more productive, or we want to do something like in, one of my oft-cited favorite cases with Liberty Mutual. We want to be able to stand up a brand new business in 6 months in Australia and compete in that area. Like, how do you even figure what value is being delivered? How do you figure like what you should be charging for, right? You can always reduce down to unit costs, and us vendors, of course, are going to charge you money. So you kind of know this baseline of costs that you have. But if all you're focusing on is recouping those costs, like, you're definitely not going to, you're not going to figure out what's valuable, right? You're going to get in this trap where you can't really place a value on removing tech debt, and so you're not going to reduce it. And then when some crazy, let's say virus thing comes along, and you all of a sudden find that you can't do delivery effectively, you can't scale up to curbside pickup, all of these types of things, all of that tech debt is going to, be charged for, right? Like, I think, and I'm citing him a lot now because I'm listening to that, new economy or new rules or whatever. But one of the mindset things that, of course, Deming goes over is like, there's just a lot of qualitative stuff that you can't place a value on, right? Like training, like there's no value to be placed on training. You can't, you can always come up with something, right? But like, it's just people need to be updated on how to do their job. Like, that someone who doesn't have the skills, as surveys show us over and over again, are less valuable than people who have the skills. So you pay for training. Similarly, right, like if you don't really know how to estimate the value that you're delivering, like the payoff, like doing a chargeback is a little weird and it can seem strange, right? If I'm charging you $5 for something that has like an unknown payback other than I want it, that's a weird dynamic. So all of those disclaimers aside, right, like be careful in pricing and make sure that you understand the dynamics of your product customer fit well, right? Like as Rohit was going over, right? Like what are people buying? What are they paying for? So that, you don't overcharge them and limit them, as in the case of the Home Depot or MasterCard, from, hinder them from doing something that's a corporate objective. Or if you want to think about it in a kind of less naive way, you could be undercharging them, right? Like, maybe you should be charging more if this stuff is more valuable. So, with that said, let's get into let's get into some of the nitty gritty, right? So, a lot of that stuff, is kind of like, I think anytime you get advice about this kind of stuff, and a lot of the work that I do, you need to bucket into two buckets. One of them is the ideal world. This is what I call the flossing world, right? The ideal world of things, which is you go to the dentist, and we all know that we should floss daily. And it's been my experience that very few people floss daily. Like, we know that it works. We know that we should be doing it. It actually kind of does take a lot of time and effort. And people keep telling us to do it, but we don't do it, right? Like, let's move on with our lives, right? People are not going to floss. Instead, we need to take that kind of defensive driving mentality of how do we build up a system that deals with the, not fallibility, but not necessarily weakness, but deals with how people actually operate with their behaviors, right? And so, instead, let's figure out a way that we can manage the slow rotting of people's teeth, right? Like, what remediations do we have, and how do we deal in the real world? So let's move on to the slow rotting of chargebacks and what we do there. Now, as I was mentioning, what a lot of people are asking about is how I gather the data for chargebacks, right? And I think, again, we at VMworld have all sorts of options for that. And there are many other competitors that simply don't exist, I know nothing about, who will also do that for you. But really, like, for example, if you look through we have a great white paper, which I will bring up here, that you can get that kind of, I don't think it's been rebranded to the the VMware livery. So pardon the pivotal references, but it goes over how to do this in Pivotal Cloud Foundry. Now, it has a lot of the kind of, disclaimers and things that I was talking about. But one of the first things that you need to figure out is the unit that you're charging for, right? And let me get down to just so you can kind of look at some of those things. But, what you're going to do once you find the unit is you basically just, most of the stuff you can just curl, right? And if you don't know what curl is, it's basically like a command line way to make a web request. And so if you have a REST interface, an API that usually returns, as you can see here, a bunch of JSON, it returns this formatted data that's human readable. It's really easy to make these calls, and then you can just do stuff with this data. But what this is showing you that if you know the right kind of time span and the unit, in pretty much every system, it's easy to kind of track usage of that system, especially something like the Tanzu application service, previously known as Pivotal Cloud Foundry, that actually tracks these things for you, right? But, there's all sorts of other ways that you can do that. Like getting that information is not always so difficult once you set it up. Now, I think what does become difficult is knowing the unit that you want to charge on, right? So I think I'm going to get my Kubernetes terminology wrong here. If I had done more prep time, I would look this up. Whatever. You can insert the right stuff, but you'll get the idea. But basically, in Kubernetes, you have, as always, step one, invent the universe. So you have the universe, you have actual companies, organizations, enterprises. Inside those enterprises, you have multiple types of infrastructure. And then we narrow down further. We have this pool of infrastructure that we're running Kubernetes on. And then, if you're having the kind of Tanzu way of thinking about things, you have kind of like the Kubernetes of Kubernetes, the manager of Kubernetes, the mom. And this is your Tanzu mission control, your Tanzu idea of being able to manage, that is, read and write, so to speak, multiple Kubernetes clusters across different types of infrastructure. So boom, then there's the next thing, your Kubernetes clusters. Now inside a Kubernetes cluster, you've got kind of all the control stuff that Kubernetes uses. And then you have, is it namespaces? I think you have namespaces. I forget if they have availability zones up there first, but you've got a namespace, which is basically like, here's a collection of stuff that certain entities have access to. And I know I'm getting this kind of wrong, but let's just kind of go with it. Inside namespaces, you have pods. And pods are collections of nodes. And I think there's kind of, it's evolving, but sometimes there's a best practice of like, I don't know how many nodes there are to a pod. And then a node basically has containers in it and the associated sidecars. Now, there's a whole bunch of other malarkey or helpful stuff like your service meshes and your network routes and your config stores and your secrets management, all these other components. But basically think about it in terms of you got everything, then you've got like all your Kubernetes clusters, then you've got your clusters, then you're subdivided into, again, sorry if I'm getting this part wrong, but you're subdivided into a kind of a namespace area, and then you're subdivided into pods and then nodes, and inside the node is a container, and then you also have storage and all these other things. Now, this usually maps into an organization as in Pivotal Cloud, in Pivotal Cloud Foundry Tanzu application service, we had an idea of an org. And an org was like a line of business, or it might even have been kind of like a cluster of applications, all sorts of things like that. And then you also have the computational resources. So there's a whole lot of units in there, right? So commonly when you're metering cloud resources or any type of resource, you can monitor by memory, by storage used, and kind of most devilishly by network traffic. And everyone will tell you that network traffic is usually the most devilish thing to monitor and the most costly. Memory usage is more or less easy, right? And storage is quite easy. As long as there's a prerequisite here that you're tracking what entity, what user, what person is using this thing, right? Like it gets more complicated but it's sort of like, think of your email quota. Whoever is logged in and is using the storage to run this application, whatever entity is doing that. So you can get all sorts of reports, right? Like again, here's a very like naive way of looking at it in the Tanzu application service area, right? Like you can get reports about who's been using it on which basis, how many instances, and in instances, think of this as a container or a process, how many hours they have. You can slice and dice it by whatever you want, right? And then you can kind of start to see the way you basically. Oh, I see. I need to get in here. You can start to see. This is the kind of dashboard that you see with anything. If I brought up the cloud health stuff, you'd see this. But you can generate these reports, and then it's usually relatively simple. You can, as some organizations like to do, they take that raw feedback and they use their own tools to generate that. Or you can just, send off PDFs for that. And then, I'm sure in your more sophisticated things, you can actually do some accounting to kind of collect that money from people. So you can determine that. So that's the thing that you need to think about. Are we going to be charging people, and I forget, there's kind of the models that they have. This paper is actually pretty good. It kind of answers all of, unfortunately, maybe fortunately, if you use the Tanzu application service, but you have to do a little bit of mapping outside of the Pivotal Cloud Foundry model for things. You like how I just allied between those two ways of naming it. But, you can figure out just we're paying you based on consumption, right? Which is kind of what I went over, based on whatever unit we determine, right? So you could just charge for a cluster and charge for the consumption across that, which, might actually be a clever way of making sure that people aren't gaming the system too much. I mean, again, it all depends on your goals, right? Is your goal to reduce memory usage or unit charges or whatever, or is your goal to encourage people to use things? That can also drive what your unit charge is, but whatever. Most people think of consumption costs, right? You could also do the kind of quota thing, which, interestingly, this paper recommends that a lot, and it'd be interesting to see if users recommend that. And the quota model, for us vendors, it's great because what you're doing is forecasting and you're paying ahead of time for things, right? Like you're paying for things, you're paying for a lump unit of stuff. Now, this model can also be kind of hazardous if it's kind of like a huge amount, dollar, euro, whatever you're dealing with, kroner, I don't know, whatever your fancy is. And if you buy too much of it over too many years, and then you find that you don't consume that amount of money, then you're going to be in this difficult situation as the owner of that quota of needing to consume it to kind of not show that you overestimated. So it's nice to be able to negotiate those quotas down. But this can be a way, I think, early on of really simplifying what's going on there, right? It's almost an anti-cloud way of charging for things. But I think initially what you want is you want to simplify things so that you're not limiting usage. And then I think even simpler is you can do just a flat rate model, right? Just which is kind of similar. It's even simpler than a quota. It's just like, here's an amount you can pay to participate in this. And you might meter it based on something. But, somewhere in those three things, if you really need to charge, and there's, of course, a hybrid model being like, I don't know, all of the above. But it's a way of, again, thinking about how you do your rate card for stuff. Now, again, what I would emphasize, even though there's all these different ways to slice things up, is I would say for the first 6 to 12 months, depending on how long things are taking, I would focus on what your higher level goals are. I hesitate to call them business goals because sometimes they're more technical goals, right? Like eliminating technical debt we have, increasing developer productivity, removing wait time from the system, getting applications on production. If you can directly link that to a business, right? Like driving revenue or cost savings to the business, right? I mean, always be careful with cost savings because, again, it's really easy to get into the trap of you get what you pay for. But I would focus on that for the first 6 or 12 months and not really charge anything, right? Like, don't charge people to come use this platform, and, maybe every 3 months revisit what you would be paying them, and definitely track what your usage is so that you don't get these crazy cost overruns you weren't expecting. But I would kind of sort out after a year what you're actually going to start charging for things. Now, also, this is going to be, again, maybe not favorable for you, the IT person, but after a year, people should know if this new platform and this new way of doing stuff is worth it, if it has a payoff, and they'll get a much better idea of what is worth paying for, right? Which you won't really know ahead of time if you go back to Rohit's kind of overview of things. So that, I think it's pretty easy to kind of figure out how to gather that raw data. But what's hard, my dog has some input she would like to give, but what's hard is figuring out how you charge for it, what your rate card is. And that is a very important thing to look at. So there's a couple of things, I referenced. There's Cloud Health you can look up to see how we do that. We have an open source project in VMware land called Purser. I don't actually know that much about it. And this is actually from a competitor, which again doesn't exist. I haven't looked at their presentation. There's one from Google as well, from the KubeCon, I think. But I think, what I would emphasize looking at is, again, really focus on what your goals are, kind of discovering what is actually worth paying for, and really focus on that. And just like you're having the business kind of iteratively learn what's worth paying attention to, just like you're having your developers iteratively learn a new way of doing things, and hopefully you, the sort of managers and executives who are managing that change, kind of iteratively learn by experimenting what happens. You're going to need to do that with your costs as well. You're not going to get it right off the bat, and you really don't want to prohibit usage of stuff, which is going to damage things ultimately. So if you're interested in learning more, let me first say that that paper I think is quite good. Let me open it up again. There's a link to it in the I'll put a link to it in the show notes, which you should be able to find if you go to the YouTube listing or wherever I put a link to it. But also if you just search for Chargebacks and Showbacks in Pivotal Cloud Foundry, it'll basically cover pretty much everything you need to know. And this was from a couple years ago, so the technology might be a little different. The way you get it might be different. But again, that model of how you're thinking about it and the maturity of when you start doing it is the important thing. Oh, that's one area I forgot that I think I won't really, since I'm towards the end here, I won't summarize it. But there's an important part, I think, in that paper to look at. Let me widen this out some more here. But that is like thinking about, so when should you be ready to think about chargebacks, right? And I would encourage you to kind of, it's a short section, but if you're thinking about this, kind of look at that section and think and use that. Again, I think part of what I like to emphasize with people, like I'm a dentist telling you you should floss or whatever. But it's good to know when to do things. I know that sounds ridiculous, but like a lot of when it comes to transforming and improving what you're doing is metering it out and starting slow and not doing everything at once. So it's good to know when it's time for you to start thinking about chargebacks. And I think there's some good steps that they go through. Basically, it's like when you're kind of mature along the lines of doing things in a cloud native way, and they kind of outline what that is. And there's also one of our large bank customers, or financial institutions, as they like to say. There's a maturity model that they used that James Waters started to use in his presentations, and we use it. And they kind of have a bottoms-up maturity thing of kind of characteristics of where you are on the journey. And as the white paper gets into, make sure that you are doing your chargeback activity at the right time. So you should check that out. Now, back to the real excitement. If you're interested in more of these things, one, just as some show notes, like I've mentioned several times, I archive all these in a playlist. If you just go to Google and you search for Tanzu Talk, I'm sure you can find it. It's also on our page. If you go to tanzu.tv, you can find it. And not only do I have all of the daily episodes here, but also the interviews that I do with people listed on there. You can go back and look through the archives. But hey, are you interested in figuring out more of these things? If you're an assist administrator, an ops person, a VI admin, you're hearing all this stuff about Kubernetes, what you should do, I would encourage you, there's a couple of things. One, you should probably get familiar with what it is. Now you can go, we have got a lot of great classes online for free. They're kind of guided ways of learning about it. Now, if you've noticed, people are always complaining about a lack of skills for new things. That would be a fun topic to go over. And companies aren't necessarily great at spending time and money on training you, which is something to consider if you're an executive. I bet you value when your company spends time on training you as a manager and executive. And you probably have all sorts of like corporate principles and things you say about how we want to take care of our people and nurture them. So you should probably do that. Now, there's another good set of coursework that's free and guided along over at Kube Academy. Just good old type that into your browser. You can go check it out. We're always adding new courses there. Now, if you want to start to understand a lot of the developer side of things, if you go to our developer portal, I still haven't figured out a good short domain name to get for it. I was thinking maybe tanzudev.pro. That would be fun. I want to use one of the corny ones like plumber or something like that. But if you go to tanzu.vmware.com/developer, we got all sorts of great developer resources there. And then finally, if you really want to start getting into it, you can set up an hour, a half-long day workshop with us. We can come and help you out to just kind of start from that tops-down thing, or, really what's best is if you bring very specific problems, and we'll see if we even can help you out. But we can start to kind of sort through that. And if you want to get the sign up for that, you can always email me at the mysterious address of codem@vmware.com. Again, I'm not really sure what a codem is, just like I don't know what a staff technologist 2 is. But these are monikers. These are titles that I've been given. They're mysteries for me to unlock. A codem. Did you know that codem backwards is mitok? Maybe I should also find, or would it be mitos? Do you say a talk at the end or a mitos? It's always, because, who knows what language that's actually from. But you could email me, or if you go to cote.pizza, you can find a little way to sign up for and request one of those workshops. Also at cote.pizza, you can get copies of my books for free, all sorts of other resources like that. And with that, we'll see everyone next time. Bye-bye. Have fun figuring out chargebacks.